Young scholars to this third and final video on East Asia prior to 1450. After watching this video, you should be able to answer these two big questions. First, what innovations were developed in China prior to 1450 and how did they spread? And second, in what ways did China exert influence on other regions of East Asia, including Korea and Japan? China played a very important role prior to 1450 in exchange that took place across the world of Afro-Eurasia. China was connected to two major trans-regional trade networks, including the Overland Trade Network, known as the Silk Road. It was the eastern end of the Silk Road, and also the eastern end of the maritime trade network known as the Indian Ocean Trade Network that connected China with Southeast Asia, India, the Middle East, and East Africa. A number of cities grew up around various markets that emerged in these locations, including cities like Hangzhou and Guangzhou. And throughout this course, we're going to keep hammering on this connection between trade and the growth of cities. One of the things that China possessed that gave them a bit of a strategic advantage were these little guys, silkworms, which when they ate a certain type of leaf, mulberry leaves, they then would spin a cocoon that would produce silk. And China was the only place in the world that understood that technology. They were the only ones that understood that if they had silkworms, they eat the mulberry leaves, they would produce one of these small cocoons, which you could then boil, and you could stretch the fibers that were produced in the cocoon out and produce silk thread. So for centuries, China had a monopoly on silk production, and silk is incredible. It really possesses three key characteristics that make it the super fabric. One, it's super lightweight, so it makes it easier to transport and carry, especially when you're carrying it across that Silk Road. Second, it's shiny and pretty to look at. And third, it's very durable. It's a very strong fabric. And so silk was in incredibly high demand in other parts of the world, including India, the Middle East, Europe. China grew increasingly wealthy from commercial exports, both the silk production, this textile production, but also they were producing porcelain, very fine pottery, which we sometimes even refer to as China. And the Chinese were the most advanced porcelain producers in the world. China also made a number of innovations in the area of iron and steel production. For a really long period of time, China was the leader in iron and steel production, which gave them a good that they could use strategically in trade. China also developed a number of new innovations during the Song dynasty, which allowed their rulers to maintain their power and legitimacy. This is one of my all-time favorites. This, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the world's first clocks. It was a giant tower, and we can see here the energy source. It was a water-powered clock. So when the water filled up these buckets, then the buckets would drop, and that created a sense of time, because as you see this repetition taking place, you could start to identify and create specific units of time. Another major innovation, this one not developed by the Chinese, but instead their neighbors to the south, the Vietnamese, was the fast-growing varieties of rice, known as champa rice. They were first imported from Vietnam, and this was critical because it allowed the Chinese to be able to produce in one growing season multiple harvests of rice. So instead of just producing one harvest, they could produce 2, 3 harvests, which meant that they could produce 2 to 3 times the amount of food. So the effect of this, whenever we have increased food, we're talking about the impact is increased population. This leads to a dramatic growth in the Chinese population right around 1000 CE. And so as we get into this period that we need to be familiar with, 1200 CE, the introduction of these fast-growing varieties of rice, champa rice, very important to the Chinese. Another major innovation, this one developed by the Chinese themselves, is gunpowder. Here's a quote: "Some have heated together sulfur, potassium nitrate with honey, smoke, and flames result, so that their hands and faces have been burnt, and even the whole house where they were working burnt down." This was from a Chinese alchemy text in the mid-800s. This was a mistake by the Chinese. They were just mixing chemicals together, and it turns out that in the process, they created what would become the basis for gunpowder. The Chinese initially used it more for fireworks displays than really for any military purpose. Later, the Mongols take this innovation, gunpowder, and start spreading it west across the Silk Road. Another major Chinese innovation, pre-1200, was paper. Prior to the invention of paper, humans had to rely on papyrus, which was a reed, or vellum, which is calf skin, not very effective. And so the Chinese developed a wood or pulp-based paper. And then finally, the Chinese developed a printing press, pre-1200. But the printing press wasn't as useful for the Chinese because they had a more pictographic style of writing. So Chinese writing involves more characters than just our 26 letters in the alphabet. So although the Chinese developed it, it really took centuries for the printing press to make its way west and spread along the Silk Road. Two other objects developed by the Chinese, the one on the left here is paper money. So they called paper money flying money because if you dropped it, it would just sort of fly into the air in comparison to the coins that they were used to carrying around. So the Song developed the world's first government-backed paper money. And then this one, another important innovation developed by the Chinese, is the maritime compass. And those objects would also spread from China along the Silk Road and Indian Ocean sea lanes to other parts of the world. In what ways did the Chinese exert influence on other regions of East Asia? To understand China's relationship with their neighbors, you have to understand a practice they put in place called the tribute system. China has all these cool innovations, and other people are interested. They have this very vibrant economy, and so other people were wanting to get in on some of that action. So to trade with China, though, diplomats from neighboring states like Vietnam, Korea, had to come to China and recognize Chinese superiority. And they did this by kowtowing in front of the emperor. So what you would have to do is you would have to come in front of the Chinese emperor and bow their head with their head touching the ground. So a kowtow is a bow of one's head with the head touching the ground, and that is the ultimate sign of deference as you're bowing at the feet of the Chinese emperor. In return, the Chinese would often give substantial gifts to these neighboring states to ensure good diplomatic relations. So this was smart strategy on the Chinese part, in the sense that they would make their neighbors happy when they gave them these gifts, and therefore they wouldn't be attacked, for instance, by their nomadic northern neighbors who are trying to cross over the Great Wall. When it comes to East Asia, China really is, in many ways, the sun, and there are various sort of satellites like Korea and Japan that rotate around that central Chinese gravitational force. So China had a huge political, economic, and cultural influence on its East Asian neighbors, including Japan and Korea. An example of this, Chinese writing. The Chinese were the first to develop a written script. Later, there were other written scripts that were developed based on those Chinese characters, and that would later form the basis for Japanese and Korean. So if you know these three languages, this one is Korean, this one is Japanese, and this is Chinese. Now, all three of these are based more on that Chinese approach to writing, which was more pictographic in nature, where you have thousands of different symbols representing various words. So the Chinese literary and scholarly traditions ultimately spread to Japan and Korea. Another example of the Chinese influence over Japan. Japan adopted elements of Confucianism, elements of Buddhism. Now, Japan's version of Buddhism is slightly different. Most people in Japan practice a form of Buddhism known as Zen Buddhism, which is a kind of a branch of Mahayana Buddhism. In addition, you had Chinese-style bureaucracy coming into existence in Japan. Japan created an emperor and started to establish a vast bureaucracy, much like the Chinese, although they don't use the civil service exam system. The Japanese also start copying China's urban planning. So if you look at the layout of Japanese cities, it's very similar to the layout of Chinese cities. And that was because you had these Japanese officials who went to China, studied and learned Chinese culture, and then brought those ideas back with them to Japan. Although we have some similarities between China and Japan, we can also identify some differences, and that might be attributable to the fact that Japan is an island, and therefore, despite being connected to China, it's also somewhat geographically isolated. An example of this, in Japan, is in addition to practicing various aspects of Buddhism and also being influenced by Confucian thought, many people in Japan still practice a distinctive cultural tradition and this native religion called Shinto. Now, Shinto is a religion where there are these various spirits in nature called kami. They're like spirits to fire and wind. And so the Japanese would create these shrines. These are Shinto shrines. This is the classic Shinto shrine design. And they would put them in various places throughout the natural world. So you might find a Shinto shrine in the middle of a lake or on the side of a mountain. And there's also a significant amount of ancestor worship that comes with the practice of Shintoism. So that's something that's totally unique to Japan. That's something that didn't spread to other parts of East Asia, but is instead a unique cultural practice of the Japanese. Another difference that you could identify, the Japanese women during this period of Japanese history from 794 to 1185, it's called the Heian period. They were very influential in terms of their writing, especially among the upper class women of the Japanese imperial court. They got into writing what is essentially these sort of gossip or romance novels, the most famous of which is The Tale of Genji. It's one of the most famous examples of early fiction writing, and it was produced by a woman. And so we can identify maybe a difference in the force in which the patriarchy influenced women in China versus Japan. So in China, we talked about that practice of foot binding, and you can contrast that with the sort of role that Japanese women played in producing a lot of important early literature. The big questions you should be able to answer after watching these 3 videos on East Asia are: 1, how did China create a relatively stable and prosperous state that lasted for over 3.5 millennia? 2nd, how are Chinese cultural traditions similar and how are they different? And how did these traditions affect East Asia over time? 3rd, what innovations were developed in China prior to 1450 and how did these innovations spread? And then finally, in what ways did China exert influence on other regions of East Asia, including Korea and Japan? As always, thanks for watching.